right, everybody, please welcome Ryan Bigg.
Yay, go me, that's awesome. All right, so yes, it is true that everyone has their own hashtag. I have mine, which is ryry. This is a name that actually my wife came up with first, ryry. And on the same day, I came into work and people started calling me ryry. I didn't tell them that my wife came up with this name. They just started organically calling me ryry, and it really freaked me out. So as a celebration of that, I'm going to have the hashtag ryry. So if you have any Twitter questions that you're too afraid to ask in person, ask them with the hashtag ryry. So I'm the junior engineering program lead at Culture Amp, which means that I don't do very much right now because the program isn't actually running, but we're going to be starting it very soon. And we'll be training about 8 juniors in how we build better culture for companies around the world with a special focus on Ruby and Elixir, and I'm beyond excited to start the program. But before we start the program, we had to interview a bunch of these people. And before that, we needed to build the junior-friendly coding test. Our coding test, as it stood at the current point in time, was a bit too severe, a bit too extreme for juniors. And so we had to find a more junior-friendly one. And here's some lessons that I learned by building it. So here we go. Coding tests are often contrived examples like implement Scrabble or the Game of Life or the toy robot. And by the way, I wrote a book about the toy robot. You should go out and buy it now. leanpub.com/toyrobot.
I bought it.
Thank you, Mel.
And then she returned it.
Thank you, Mel. I was going to say you've paid for like a quarter of a box of nappies for my daughter, so thank you. But if you've returned it, fuck you.
I knew you could. It's very, very good.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you. So yeah, they talk about Scrabble, they talk about Game of Life, they talk about Toy Robot, and they talk about Monopoly. But what if they don't get the Game of Life? What if they can't figure out the Toy Robot? What if they've never played a game of Scrabble in their life? What are you really testing for? Is any of this relevant to your company? Are you a company that produces toy robots? Are you a company that solves Scrabble perfectly given a starting rack? If not, why test on these things? And this kind of reminds me of my favorite Zach Holman tweet, which is, I think programming riddles, games, and brain teasers are a great way to hire. First one to say, fuck this and walk out gets the job. And he nails it so perfectly. This is what Twitter is so good for, is this kind of short succinctness, beautiful, beautiful story. And so you should really be testing for your domain. Don't test for the toy robot. Don't test for Scrabble. Don't test for bloody word count or Linux tools. Test for what your company actually does, please, for the love of all that is precious. So what does Culture Amp do? Well, we improve culture at companies around the world, of course, that's obvious, but it's hard to test for that in a coding test example. And it's not like we can just say, you've incremented the culture count by 1, congratulations, you've got the job. It's not how it works. So we have to test for something more solid than that. And that is surveys. We test for surveys, essentially. We do surveys. And surveys have responses and questions and answers and so on and so forth. So we care at Culture Amp if you can reason well about our domain model, surveys, responses, questions, and answers, as I said before. And so it makes sense that our coding test, both our regular one and our junior-friendly one, should be about that too. And our standard coding test works with surveys and responses primarily, and we needed to come up with a more friendly junior-friendly coding test. And here's the steps that I used to do that. The first step was to build a rubric. Who knows what the word rubric means? Wow, that's like 10 more people than I expected. All right, so you've all done teaching before. That's good. So rubrics, for the people who don't know, rubrics are multi-dimensional, and this is not the Doctor Who kind of multi-dimensional. It's literally just an Excel spreadsheet of, you've got rows and columns. It's pretty boring. Rubrics are multi-dimensional sets of scoring guidelines that can be used to provide consistency in evaluating student work. They spell out scoring criteria so that multiple teachers using the same rubric for a student's essay, for example, would arrive at the same score or grade. Thank you, Google. I wouldn't even been able to come up with that explanation on my own. And it sounds really easy to build it up, but it really isn't. So when I was building this up for the junior-friendly coding test, I had to think of a couple of core guidelines, and they were these things. They were adherence to the Ruby style guide. So code had to be indented with 2 spaces. You had to make sure Rubicop was adequately satisfied. There was clean and simple Ruby, which kind of like the first and second point are kind of the same thing here. Is that Bit of echo. I'm sorry. This is the musician being pedantic about audio quality. Really ruined my flow, man. And I wanted to make sure that code worked if the test requirements changed. So we had some code submissions that actually failed this third item in the rubric. So that was important that we included in the core of what we were grading on. And then I thought outside of the core, so this is pretty generic stuff. This is like you'd have this on any coding test. Make sure that it adheres to the Ruby style guide. It's clean and simple Ruby code. It's the same as any company. But what I wanted to test out for the junior coding test was that they knew array methods like count, detect, select, any, and none. And that they were, as a bonus kind of side of things, they would refactor common logic between methods into separate methods. So if one method and another method had the same code in it, they would move that common code out to a separate method. And that really led to better scores for the juniors that did that. So from there, I could expand the rubric. And as a focus for the coding test, I chose array methods because I thought that was kind of a level up from the basic Ruby stuff. You know your hashes, you know your arrays, you know your integers, you know your classes and your modules. I want to go a little, like one step further than that. What's one step further than that? And what I could come up with was array methods. So that's why I decided to focus on that with the coding test. So the second step here was to model the core components of the domain @cultureamp and to use these to construct a framework for the coding test. So the domain @cultureamp, as I said before, is mostly surveys, questions, responses, answers, and users. And here's a very, very intelligent diagram that I totally did not draw with my fingers at all. It's really just a fancy finger painting using an iPad. And our actual domain models of CultureAmp are a little more complicated than this, but essentially it is this. This is the core of CultureAmp right here on the slide for you to see. And from this, we can then build the coding test. So once we've understood the core of what we're trying to get people to understand, then we can write some tests on that. So the third step is to build challenges. We know the core model that we want to test on, surveys, responses, questions, answers, and users. And now we want to build some challenges on that. So I started off by thinking of what kind of work do we do with the data? We might want to find a particular response for a particular user. So in this case, I came up with a slightly contrived example of a for method which took a list of responses and a user, and its job was to return was to return a response that matched the query. So you would ask response for, here's the list of responses and here's a user, give me the response that has this user. And in the rubric, I wrote this find code that actually used it as an example. And I gave this as a good example of code. This is the kind of code that we were looking for in the coding test. What I failed to do in the rubric was to include bad examples of the code, like what you see in red down here. And I think that would have really helped the reviewers. There was a lot of questions about, is this code good enough or is this code horrible? And I think including good and bad examples in the rubric would have really helped alleviate those types of concerns. So probably in the next time we do the coding test, I'll include both good and bad examples. The step 4 of this was to also do the coding test myself. I was checking for spelling mistakes and making sure the coding test could actually be completed, because what's the point of sending a coding test out if it has spelling mistakes in it, or if they try and make a test pass and it's actually asserting the wrong thing? It might assert the array is 3 items long, it's actually 2. And they might think they're a failure and they might not go any further in the coding test. So I had to do it myself. And it really helped me solidify the rubric's code examples too. These are some of the questions that I asked myself when I was going through the coding test, and I actually rewrote it 3 times myself. So the first time I went through it, I was really unhappy with it. The second time I went through it, I was kind of moderately sort of unhappy. I'd say like 75% unhappy, 25% happy. And the third time I was like, right, this is it. This is like the final thing. I'm going to be happy with this. So does what we're testing for in the coding test actually test against the rubric? Otherwise, if the coding test and the rubric don't match, what are we actually grading on? Like, that doesn't make sense. So I tried to make it as combined, as aligned as possible. And the second question was, would this be easy for someone unfamiliar with the domain to understand? Would this be would the relationship between surveys and questions and answers and responses and answers be easy for someone to understand if they've never worked in that industry before? Are we testing on just basic concepts? And the third question was, am I testing on the right level? Am I testing for some kind of esoteric Ruby, like when I think it was 1.8 and 1.9, the question mark character changed its return value? Am I testing for that kind of crap in Ruby? Am I testing for like hashes as a JSON hash in Ruby 2 works, but 1.9 it doesn't? Am I testing for that kind of crap? So that's the kind of questions I asked myself. Step 5 was get feedback on it. So I'm really good at evaluating myself. Clearly, as you can tell, I'm not totally egotistical. But I decided to ask other people for feedback because one of our values at ColdTramp is to learn faster through feedback. So I gave the coding test to some people. I gave it to Lauren in the audience there. Hi, Lauren. I gave it to Rami. I gave it to a couple of people outside the organization. I said, hey, look at this. This is our coding test. Can you go through it and give me any kind of feedback? And I asked them all a couple of questions. I said, what do you find easy? What did you find hard? And would you change anything? And from this, they gave some awesome feedback. So step 5A was to fix everything. Turns out that the coding test I was happy with was not something they were happy with. So I had to realign it to make sure they were happy with it. That took a couple of days. Yeah, so I spent just a couple of days polishing it and making sure it was in ship shape for when it got sent out. So we had about 60 people get through to the finals, the coding test stage of the junior program, and we sent that coding test out to those people, and they were happy with it. They went through it and they submitted it back at regular intervals, I would say. And then step 6A, I think, is wait. So we set a deadline of the coding test for 2 weeks. So we gave people 2 weeks to complete the coding test, regardless of from when they interviewed to when they had to submit the coding test. And the funny thing with deadlines is that at least 30 people will submit it on the day that it's due. And some people would even submit it the day after it was due and say like, oh, sorry, I'm too busy. We forgave them, it's okay. And 2 days before our first coding deadline, I thought I was almost done reviewing the coding test, and boy, was I wrong. I received about 15 more coding tests that day, and I cried myself to sleep that night. Once we got the coding tests back, we went about reviewing them, and I had a team of awesome people at ColdTramp reviewing them, looking over them, judging them, based not on their own opinions, but on the rubric. And this is the critical part. Without that rubric, you'd have personal opinions factoring into this. You'd have people perhaps grading men better because of their own internal biases, or women grading women better because of their internal biases. The rubric nullifies that stuff. It says, this is how it should be written, or close enough to this. This is the guidelines that we have set forward. It has to meet these guidelines. We don't care about your internal biases. Grade according to the rubric. And that's the critical part here on step 7. And it ensured a fairer judging process than otherwise, I think. Step 8 was probably the hardest part, and after the review, we sent every single person who submitted the coding test some feedback, and on average, we sent 7.5 pages of feedback per candidate. That's 7.5 pages per feedback, yes, 7.5 pages of feedback for 60 candidates, which is about 350 pages. So, hi, yes? What was the maximum? Maximum? I'm not sure. I remember one coding test I reviewed, which was probably closer to 14 or 15 pages. But I'm not going to say who that was, of course.
Did they get the job?
No.
But they still want, like that's.
They would still learn from that feedback. So that's what I'm trying to get at here. Is at ColdTramp, one of our values, as I said before, is to learn faster through feedback. And so I thought it wouldn't make sense just to give people that blasé, yes, you got the job, or no, you didn't get the job, after the feedback, right? They need something to learn from. And so that's what we did. We gave them good feedback on the coding test on what they could use to improve themselves. And I will say that this thing didn't just happen overnight. I didn't just review 60 coding tests and bam, that was it, done. No, it took 2.5 bloody weeks. It took a very long time of me reviewing about 8 coding tests per day myself and the team reviewing several others themselves. And I will say also, sometimes it was a struggle to find anything to give feedback on because the coding test matched the rubric almost. It was like, you'd open a coding test and it would be perfect. And you're like, has this person read my mind or read the rubric? Have they hacked my computer? Have they looked at it? Like, this just is so brilliantly perfect. And other times, not so much. But let's not go into that. Let's focus on the good stuff. The other times not so much meant that we were able to give really good feedback and direction for that person. Because at other companies, what might happen is they might just be given that flat no, and they're like, why? What did I do wrong? How can I improve from this? What we're trying to do is give them some actionable feedback so they can actually continue on and improve their skills. So I say here, give A.S.K feedback, and I'm about to go into that. So A.S.K, who knows what that stands for? Anyone? Nope. All right, cool. That should excite you. It stands for actionable, specific, and kind. And I learned this through my friend Bo Jeans. He learned it through his friend Mike. It stands for actionable, specific, and kind. Any feedback you give, coding test or otherwise in your entire employment life, should be these three things. If it's not one of these three things, don't give it. It has to be actionable, it has to be specific, and it has to be kind. So, as I say here, it has to be actionable, specific, and kind. If it was only actionable and specific but not kind, it would be rude. And if it was actionable and kind, it wouldn't be specific, so how could you action it? And if it was specific and kind but not actionable, what do you do with it? So it doesn't make sense. It has to be all these three things: actionable, specific, and kind. So I read through the reviews that I gave to people, and I tried removing things that didn't meet this criteria. I'm confident things slipped through, but I tried making sure that everything met this criteria. I think that's a very good thing to do on a coding test. And it turned out that a lot of people like this feedback. They said the feedback provided is very valuable information which will help me improve for future interviews. I wanted to say thank you for the detailed feedback that was supplied for the coding challenge. And thank you for your feedback. I feel like I've already learned a lot from it. This was awesome to see. This really validated the whole point of giving people that feedback, which was awesome. It's just so good. And I hope that it gives people a good impression of Culture Amp, even if we did reject them in the end, that maybe they might want to apply again in the future. And now that part of the process is over, I've gained a lot of feedback from the candidates and ideas from what their responses have been to the coding test themselves, and I can improve the coding test from there, and hopefully next time produce a better coding test for them to do. And that all leads to a much better, nicer coding test and experience for everyone overall, and I think that's quite good. So that's all I really have to say tonight. Do we have any questions in the audience tonight? Thank you.
How long do you estimate the coding test will take for the juniors?
Okay, so I got asked this question a couple of times during the interview process, and my comment answer was 3 to 4 hours, with reasonable expectations that you spend a lot of that time looking at Ruby documentation, trying to write some tests and failing at some code, but 3 to 4 hours, I think, was the answer that I commonly gave. Do you think that would be fair for a coding test?
That's not how we do it, but yeah.
No? How do you do it?
We pay people we pay them.
Yep.
Do 2 8-hour blocks. The first 8 hours, and if they succeed, they get another half of the test.
Nice. Yep. I would like to do that also at Culture Amp. I think that's one thing we're lacking. We're not paying people for the work they put into the coding test.
Did you get data on how long people actually spent on it?
Wait for the mic, people.
Did you get data on how long people actually spent on it?
No, we didn't get data on how long people actually spent on the coding test, unfortunately. I would have loved to have somehow been able to time it, but alas not. Get longer, maybe.
Well, I have the mic. Sorry. While you were marking them, did you find things that were missing from the rubric? Like...
Oh, yes. Well, some coding tests came back, and I was like, their code is shorter than the rubric's code. Like, what are they doing here? Oh, that's cool. I was like, that's totally an awesome way to write it. I never would have thought about that. And I was really impressed with some of the submissions, just some of the cleanliness of the Ruby that was coming back. And it really made me think of how to improve my own Ruby as well, which is really good to see. So I was very impressed by some of the examples.
Hey.
Hi, Tom.
Hey, Ryan. You might remember me from the code test.
I do. Tom was one of my victims. Targets.
Bastard. I might be a junior, given that I didn't know Ruby before I started the code test, but I can give you some data if you like, that it took me about 60 hours.
60?
I was away on a hotspot for a wedding and stayed up all night for a week or so because I had to, I guess, figure out what to search before I could then search it and then understand it. So that's some feedback that, yeah, for a very junior who doesn't know Ruby yet to try to show potential, I guess it does take a lot longer, but that's obviously for me to experience as I go through.
Still, it's good to get the data point. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering if you have any thoughts, once people have been through this process a couple of times and they've posted their solutions and their feedback online, what happens with your coding test and whether it's like, whether you've thought of that as being a bad thing or like an okay thing to do or like a neutral thing to do?
I have thought of that. So I've been thinking through this whole feedback process that by giving people essentially what is the answers to the coding test, we make sure that they couldn't possibly do the coding test a second time. Because we're not just giving them a flat no, we're literally telling them, this is the code you wrote and this is how we would prefer it to be written. And that literally gives them the answers to the coding test. So what they need to do next time they submit it is to copy and paste the answers we gave them into the coding test and we passed them. Congratulations, all well done, right? So I think the catch with that is that we're probably going to have to rewrite the coding test or at least restructure it for the next round. I think that is to our benefit more than our detriment, but only slightly. It means that we've invested a lot of effort into writing the coding test as its original state now, and we essentially have to chuck it out and rewrite it. I think overall, it might lead to a cleaner, better coding test in the future, but right now, it's like on that hairline of like, it's slightly better overall because we'd have a better coding test. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about people kind of gaming the system or whether it's a good thing if someone's looking into this stuff so much that they're able to give you exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, we had a couple of examples of that. People saying they didn't have much Ruby experience and then submitting near perfect coding tests, and that was, we required a further investigation into those people. But that is something that we are conscious of, and I'm hoping to investigate more in the future. Probably testing on things that aren't just the array method select, none, and any. Hoping to test on other Ruby concepts in the future.
Give me a minute.
So you're doing this test for junior devs.
Yes.
What is your definition of a junior dev? Because a lot of the concepts that you explained here that you test for seem to me to be sort of refinements on what I would expect a junior dev to be good at. I would expect them to be able to write functional code in somewhat readable code, but not necessarily be on top of all the refinements that make it really clean and elegant code. So what was your angle in that?
My angle was that they've done significant enough Ruby research to discover the array and enumerable methods at least. That's primarily what the coding test was looking for, and that it's really hard in the coding test to kind of think about so in the junior role, you might be expecting people to have a certain level of Ruby experience, and you can't be like, you have to meet this watermark. It's not like at a ride, a carnival ride, it's not like you must be this tall to ride and people under that height can't ride. It's really hard to gauge. So my test was they did some research into arrays and enumerables and they knew what methods were available to them. My guide for a junior would be somebody who's dedicated at least a couple of months to learning Ruby. We've had some people go through actually some coding boot camps. So people 3 and 6 months coding boot camp experience who have gone through to the final stages of the program so far, which has been really impressive. So people who have at least dedicated a couple of months of their time to learning Ruby, I think that's kind of my watermark for Ruby junior Ruby developers at this current point in time. It's really hard to put like a figure on it, like the carnival ride. It's not like you have to be 170 centimeters, you have to have at least 3 months Ruby experience. 3 months Ruby experience for one person can be way different to 3 months Ruby experience for a different person. So you really have to have it on a case-by-case basis. Malevsky.
God. People are determined to make me get
Did
exercise.
you? I know, right? Here it comes.
So I suppose in the with a view of transparency, one, did you actually tell the applicants what the rubric was? Would that have been a good idea? And I suppose in retrospect, would you open source, given that you couldn't reuse your test, would you open source it so others could potentially base theirs off what the work you guys have done?
So regarding the rubric, so the written rubric that I wrote up actually included the answers to the questions. So it was like the responses for method had to use find or detect to actually be functional. You could write it in an each way as I showed in the slide, but that would be more code than what was necessary. The rubric that I did share with people was that core rubric that had to be compatible with the Ruby style guide. It had to pass the Rubicop validations, clean and simple Ruby, and if the test changed at all, then it had to be compatible with that. And some people failed that rubric as itself. I think sharing the more extended rubric with them would have given away the answers, and I think there's a tough balance to strike there between, do we give them, you have to know array and enumerable methods, and that kind of gives them too much of a hint, and then everyone submits a perfect coding test? Or do we give them very little information and they have to go and figure out the answers on their own? It's, again, a very, very tough balance to strike. Now, regarding open sourcing the coding test itself, that is a possibility. I would like to do it, but I don't know if the powers that be at Culture would support me in doing that. I would have to chat with them about that. I would love to open source a rubric and open source the coding test, but it may give away future coding tests. That's the only concern. Our data model is not going to change significantly before the next time we give a coding test. It's still going to be surveys, questions, responses, answers, and users. And that's likely what the next coding test would be on as well. Does that answer your question? Questions?
We'll talk later.
We will. Thanks, Dad.
Right. Let's everybody thank Ryan. If you've got any questions, I will... All right, fine.
One more, come on.
It's not even a question, it's just me butting in. I think it's worth noting that the repo, I believe, came with Rubicop, installed and instructions on how to run Rubicop and how to run the test. And so, there was that feedback of you're going to be, measured on these things, but here is how to actually see,
it did.
those details. We're not just going to leave you in the lurch and have you figure that out by yourself.
Yeah, it did. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan.